Chapter 3, The Human Body. Are we really what we eat? And the following up in depth on food allergies. So to begin with, let's talk a little bit about why do we eat in terms of the basic necessities. Right? Food provides us with energy. Right? So to do all of our body processes, or what's called our metabolism, we need energy to do that. Right? That's also going to provide us with heat for body temperature regulation, which is extremely important to humans. Food also provides the building blocks for the growth and maintenance of body tissues. Things like proteins are really necessary in growing and producing our tissues. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we may want to eat. Right? For the most part, food is really connected to our sense of taste, but the truth is what we appreciate as the sense of taste is actually more based upon smell than anything else. That's why if you've ever had a very bad cold and a very bad snuffy nose, you can't taste food as well, and you may have a loss of appetite. But some of our other senses as well are tightly connected with food as well. Something like the sight of food. If you see a slice of your favorite pizza, you may then have the desire to go and consume that pizza, even if you maybe are not physiologically hungry. Touch. Now, some of us might not think of touch, but touch has a lot to do with the texture of food, whether we want it or don't want it. So certain food has pleasing texture, and certain food does not have pleasing texture. Sometimes even hearing the sound of a Coca-Cola can snapping open may encourage you or may lead you to want to consume that type of food. Now, there are a lot of different reasons why we want to eat. Okay, the physiological reasons are associated with hunger. Hunger is a physiological mechanism. It's regulated by internal cues. It's regulated by either the absence of food in our digestive tract or a drop in our blood sugar levels. That's true hunger. Now, appetite is quite different. Appetite is a psychological or a mental desire to eat. This is most apparent if you have just consumed a very large meal and you're quite full, but then you see your favorite dessert go by on a dessert cart and you have a desire to eat that dessert, and sometimes will even overeat and overindulge. Now, the feeling of being full is the opposite of hunger, and that is called satiety. Now, if you are satiated, you no longer have hunger. Now, true hunger is something that most people in the United States don't feel on a regular basis. We are often programmed to eat on other types of cues rather than simply a physiological cue of hunger. We eat based upon what time it is. We eat based upon social cues. We eat based upon cravings. And that's something that we're going to explore in this chapter. And one of the blogs that you will be working on for this chapter is the What About You blog, in which you're going to track your food for 3 days, your eating for 3 days, along with the cues that are making you eat. And that's explained in depth in your blog. Now, there is a specific term called anorexia, and anorexia is when there is still a physiological need for food, but there's no appetite. And anorexia can become pronounced and problematic. Now, while you're doing this, you should also view the control of appetite, hunger, and satiety available on either the Mastering Nutrition or on the Blackboard. In terms of focusing on the hunger and satiety portion, those physiological portions, let's look at some of the things that play a role in our hunger and satiety signals. Believe it or not, a big part of what allows us or leads us to feel hunger or satiety is the brain, specifically a region of the brain called the hypothalamus. Right? Now, the hypothalamus is a region of the brain that is tightly connected with our hormone or endocrine system. And the hypothalamus has control over a lot of things, not just hunger and satiety. But that's one of the things that it does. So certain nerve cells within the stomach and small intestines can actually sense the presence of food or the absence of food, and they can send messages to the hypothalamus. And then that can lead the hypothalamus to either increasing or decreasing our hunger or satiety signals. We're also going to look a little bit at some hormones that help to relay messages to the hypothalamus as well, and those are hormones related to blood glucose. And in truth, the types and amounts of foods that are consumed help to influence satiety as well. Now, there are different signals that may prompt us to eat. Nerve receptors in the stomach actually can sense distension if the stomach is expanded or if the stomach is empty. And that is going to send signals to the hypothalamus that will help feed into our satiety or hunger signaling. Another key component is insulin and glucagon. Now, insulin and glucagon, these are hormones, and those hormones are triggered by blood glucose levels. Blood glucose is a measure of how much glucose is available in the blood, and both of those are going to have an effect on our feelings of hunger and satiety. Now, in general, this is not an endocrinology class, but just to give you a quick background, hormones, we use the term hormone. You've all heard hormones before. But what hormones are, these are chemicals that are produced in specialized glands or cells throughout the body. They're released from those specialized glands or cells, and they then travel to the bloodstream to target organs. Now, hormones play a role in a vast majority of our body processes. We're just going to focus on some hormones can actually stimulate hunger, and then some hormones can produce a feeling of satiety. It's very complex, especially in humans, because there's so many other factors playing a role. Now, in terms of why we want to eat, there are certain things that are going to have a direct effect on our feelings. Part of it has to do with the type of food that we eat. So proteins tend to have a higher satiety value, whereas carbohydrates have lower satiety value. So if you were to eat bacon and eggs for breakfast versus if you were to eat white toast or cereal for breakfast, that high protein, high fat diet would probably keep you satiated or prevent you from becoming hungry longer. And even if they are the same number of calories. So this is not based upon calories. Remember, proteins and carbohydrates have the same number of kilocalories per gram. So we're talking the same number of grams, same number of proteins and carbohydrates, same caloric intake. Proteins will tend to lead to higher satiety. Foods that are bulky or foods that are more solid tend to be more filling. So the caloric equivalent of one apple versus apple juice, right? Eating that solid apple is going to be more filling than drinking the caloric equivalent in juice. Now we'll explore this a bit more in terms of some of the other environmental cues that are going to trigger appetite, but these would be things like sensory information, how something looks or smells or tastes, social and emotional cues, whether you are eating because you're out with your friends and you go to Applebee's and everyone is eating so you eat as well, learning in terms of what's culturally acceptable in terms of eating. And those are all things that are covered within the text, and you should give that a read over. Now, for the rest of this chapter, we're going to focus on what happens when eating occurs. So we're going to first look at a very, very brief overview of the organization of the body, and taking in food, taking in nutrients, what do we do with it? So for the most part, those nutrients we talked about, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats, these are very large molecules. And the goal of taking them in, the goals of digestion, are to take those big molecules and break them down to something that's smaller and usable so that it can be then absorbed into the body. So let's just review some of our basic organization of life. Okay, if you've had either introductory bio or introductory chemistry or anatomy and physiology, this should all be familiar. If you haven't ever had any of these science classes before, the book does give a nice explanation, and feel free to contact the instructor for more clarification. So atoms, these are the smallest units of matter. We're not going to go into atomic structure, but these are the smallest parts, if you will, of matter. Molecules, then, the term molecule is when we have atoms that are bonded together in a specific way. So a very clear example is the example of water. Right? Water is H2O. It's going to be two atoms of hydrogen bound to an atom of oxygen to create H2O. Now, you might wonder, how is this related to us and humans in the body? Well, everything that we're eating, when we eat carbohydrates, when we eat proteins, when we eat fats, fats are molecules, carbohydrates are molecules. So you have to understand the basics of molecular organization in order to understand digestion. Now let's take a look at the body. Now if we're talking about an organism, we'll use humans as a model since it's a nutrition class. We have our very smallest molecules are the atoms. Atoms come together to form molecules. Those molecules then form cells. Cells are then going to form these larger structures called tissues. tissues will form organs, and then organs function together in organ systems. So let's take a few minutes just to look at these steps. Okay. Cells are, by definition, the smallest unit of life. Cells are going to be made of different molecules that come together, and they form these discrete units of life. And when we mean by smallest unit of life, this is the smallest recognizable machinery, if you will, that does life-sustaining processes. So a really quick overview of cells. Cells have what's called a cell membrane, and that cell membrane is going to be this outer covering that surrounds the entirety of the cell. Now this is just one kind of generalized example cell, what a cell might look like. Now this cell membrane is going to be very important when we try and talk a bit more about digestion and especially absorption, because this cell membrane has this unique structure, or we see these lipids that form this double or bilayer, where we have these tails that are fatty that point in, and then these heads that face out. And this creates what's called a selectively permeable membrane. So only certain things can pass through, and that what can pass through will be regulated by proteins within the cell membrane. Now within the cell proper, right, there's fluid component, and then there are structural components. So those structures are called organelles, and those might be things like the nucleus that we see here, the mitochondria, which produces energy for the cell, the endoplasmic reticulum, which will produce protein for the cell, okay? And then the space is full of a fluid that is called cytoplasm. Now, different cells of similar types can come together to form a particular organization called a tissue. Tissue is where you have similar types of cells acting together. So this would be examples of things like muscle tissue, nervous tissue. Right? And then those tissues can come together to form organs. Right? Now organs are what you're probably most familiar with in terms of the human body. They're the big things that we can see. So things like the stomach, the heart, and the brain. The stomach is actually made of several different kinds of tissues. So there is a muscular tissue that's involved, and that's what's going to allow the stomach to contract and to basically squish the food around in it. There's an inner lining of the stomach, which produces a mucus. That mucus is protective, and that's actually a type of tissue that's called an epithelial tissue. There'll be some connective tissues that hold this all together. Right? So we see a whole bunch of different kinds of tissue that form the stomach. Now the next part then are what are called organ systems. Right? And the organ systems are where you take these different organs by themselves, which don't really function by themselves, and you put them into an entire working system. Okay? So for example, the stomach would be part of the gastrointestinal system, and since this is a nutrition class, that's where we'll focus. Now in tracing the path that food undergoes, it's going to first be digested. Digested is the process of breaking things apart, either mechanically or chemically. It then must be absorbed, and that's when the nutrients that we want are taken into the body. And then finally, the excess, whatever is not usable, needs to be eliminated. Right? And this occurs within the gastrointestinal tract. Now, at this point, there are several nice animations that you should take a look at, and those are housed in either Mastering Nutrition or on Blackboard. So here's a quick overview of the GI tract. The GI tract really includes the stomach and the intestines. It is continuous with the mouth and the esophagus. Now it is a single long tube that is broken up in different places by what are called sphincters. And sphincters, you can think of them as leading to there being little compartments in here. So the food passes down the esophagus into the stomach, and there's a sphincter between the stomach and the esophagus so that food can't go the wrong way and come back out normally. Now when we talk about digestion, there are two main ways that we can digest food. The first is mechanical digestion, and this is a physical breakdown of food. One of the most obvious kinds of mechanical digestion is the act of chewing, which takes a large piece of food and breaks it into smaller pieces. But then there's also chemical digestion, and these are enzymatic reactions that require enzymes. Enzymes are special proteins that can break down chemicals, that can break down the macronutrients, like, say, carbohydrates or proteins, into smaller parts. So let's start this process off. Let's imagine you go and you are eating some food. So let's say it's lunchtime and you decide you're going to go over and get a turkey sandwich from the local food shop. Before digestion actually even begins, before consumption of the food actually even begins, you may experience what's called a cephalic reaction. And this is when your body starts getting ready to take food in. And that's actually due to a lot of those other cues that we talked about, the sensory cues. So it could be the smell of the turkey sandwich or the sight of the turkey sandwich or just the knowledge that you're about to consume it. This would lead to things like the salivary response, where your mouth might start drooling a little bit. You may get a rumble in your tummy. This is the body preparing itself for this food that it's now anticipating. Now, once you take a bite of your food, take a bite of that turkey sandwich, and you start chewing it, a lot of that is going to be mechanical digestion to break that food into smaller pieces. Now, there's a few reasons that that's important. One reason is that it needs to be able to pass through our body. So it needs to be able to fit through our esophagus and fit into our stomach. The other reason we do mechanical digestion is the smaller the pieces of food are, the better able the enzymes involved in chemical digestion can actually attack that to break it down. Now, in terms of within the mouth, there's not a lot of chemical digestion that takes place. One of the things that does occur is we do have something called salivary amylase. This is an enzyme that's found within saliva. And this starts to break down carbohydrates. And you can actually experience this if you take a dry cracker, something like a saltine cracker, and if you chew on it for a while without swallowing it and continue to chew it, it'll start to actually taste sweet to you. What happens is as you're mechanically breaking that cracker down, the salivary amylase is also breaking down those larger carbohydrates. And when you break down carbohydrates, you start breaking them down to simple sugars, which your body then senses, your tongue then senses as sweet. Now, in terms of then swallowing, right, we have this nice little trapdoor called an epiglottis, which helps to prevent food from going down our trachea or windpipe while we're eating. Right. Once we swallow that food, it then passes further on through the GI tract. So let's just take a quick look over here. So this, of course, is the mouth. The epiglottis would be shown right over here. Here's the trachea or the windpipe. This epiglottis acts like a little trapdoor, so that when we go to swallow our food, we actually use the food is swallowed by taking our tongue and pushing our tongue up and back across the back of our mouth, and then it helps us to swallow what's now called a bolus of food. Once you've taken that turkey sandwich or that saltine cracker and you've chewed it up, it becomes a mushy lump. That mushy lump is called a bolus, and that needs to then pass down through the esophagus or into the esophagus, and we don't want it going to the trachea. Now, if you've ever started laughing or talking while you are trying to swallow your food, you may have gotten a small amount of food here in your trachea, and that usually leads to a very uncomfortable coughing fit as your body tries to then expel that food from your trachea. Now, when you take a look at this, here you can see this would be during swallowing. Right. The epiglottis is folded down. The bolus of food is now passing down into the esophagus. Okay. Now this esophagus is going to go down. It's going to continue all the way down to the stomach. The way food moves partially has to do with gravity, but for the most part, we also see what's called peristalsis. And peristalsis is when we get these wave-like contractions of the esophagus that actually pushes the food down. Now, there's no digestion occurring within the esophagus. The esophagus is simply a muscular tube that moves the bolus of food from the mouth or the oral cavity down into the stomach. Now, between the stomach and the esophagus is the gastroesophageal sphincter. Okay. This helps to keep food that's in the stomach from coming back into the esophagus, and this is really important, especially when we talk about what happens in the stomach. The stomach, there is a lot of mechanical digestion. That's the contractions, the muscular contractions of the stomach helps to mix the food with gastric juices. And then there's going to be a lot of chemical digestion as well. Now, gastric juice is a mix of something called hydrochloric acid, and this acid is important in denaturing or breaking down proteins, and it also activates pepsin. Pepsin is in its inactive state, it's called pepsinogen. It gets activated by acids, and that active pepsin is an enzyme that starts to chemically digest protein. There's also gastric lipase that digests fat. Now, when you see ACE at the end of a word, lipase, that tells you that it's an enzyme. Now, not all enzymes end in ASE, but most things ending in ASE are enzymes. And I previously mentioned that the stomach has a lining that is mucus lined on the inside, because you can imagine if the stomach was only muscle is protein, then pepsin would break down the muscle wall. So we have this mucus layer that's produced by something called epithelial tissue, and that mucus helps protect the stomach lining. So within the stomach, we get this bolus that enters. The bolus gets broken around with the contractions of the stomach. We see the release of the gastric juices, hydrochloric acid and the pepsins. Okay. And that contraction then takes the food and turns it basically into a slurry that's called chyme. Right? And that chyme will then pass through what's called the pyloric sphincter into the first part of our small intestine. Chemical digestion is going to continue in the small intestine, and here we're going to see enzymes produced by the pancreas, as well as the addition of bile. Now, bile is very interesting. Bile emulsifies fat. What emulsification means is that fat is taken and broken into smaller pieces. Now, this is different than chemical digestion. If you think about fat and water, oil and water, for example, if you took water and you poured oil into it, they would separate. Water and oil don't mix. Fat, by definition, doesn't mix with water. So what an emulsification does is it takes this big blob of fat and breaks it into much smaller blobs, teensy tiny blobs, so that way lipases, the actual enzymes that can break the fats down, can get in there and take it apart. Now, the liver actually produces the bile, but the gallbladder stores the bile. The other important organ here is the pancreas, and the pancreas is going to produce a whole slew of digestive enzymes, but also something called bicarbonate. Bicarbonate ion is going to help to neutralize, it's basic, and it's going to neutralize the chyme. You can imagine that as food comes out of the stomach here, it's very acidic because of all the hydrochloric acid. But the small intestine over here is not an acidic environment. So something has to happen to this chyme coming out of the stomach to remove that acidity, and that's where the bicarbonate comes into place. So leaving our stomach then, the food, now in the form of chyme, would pass through the small intestine. There are really three main parts of the small intestine. They are called the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Now, the small intestine is called the small intestine because it has a narrow diameter. However, it is very long compared to what's called the large intestine. And this is where we're going to see most of the continued digestion of things like we have pancreatic amylase, which digests carbohydrates, pancreatic lipases, which digest fats, and proteases to digest protein. At the same time, we do have that bicarbonate that's neutralizing the acidic chyme. Now, absorption is very important here. Digesting the food, breaking it down to smaller pieces is all well and good, but we have to be able to take those smaller nutrients now and bring them into the body. I know that you may think that having food in your intestine means it's in your body, but when I say in your body, I mean into the body in the sense of having those nutrients brought to your cells, okay, which means they have to get into the blood. The blood is what's going to transfer the nutrients to the cells. So that process is called absorption. Very little absorption occurs in the stomach. Most absorption is going to occur within the small intestines. And part of that has to do with the lining of the GI tract in that area, where we're going to see what are called villi and brush border or microvilli. So if we take a look at the small intestine and we were to take a sample of it and cut it through, we would see that the inside is very lined with all of these folds. And those folds are called, each of those folds then have smaller folds on top of those called villi. And the villi then have on top of them little tiny projections called microvilli. Right? So each cell has projections, and then the cells lined up form projections, right? And then those line up into folds. Now what this does, this really hugely increases the surface area, or the area within your small intestine, to allow for absorption to occur. because the very small, now broken down nutrients can be absorbed into these cells. Now, what we see in each of these villi is we see blood supply, so this is a capillary loop, and then we see something else called a lacteal, right? Now, most of the nutrients that we take in are going to, once they're digested, they will get absorbed through these cells, through their microvilli, and into the blood. From the blood, they can then be taken to the rest of the cells. Certain things, though, don't go well into the blood, and part of that are fats. So those fats instead are going to be taken into the lacteals, and those lacteals are part of your lymphatic system. So here we see the circulatory system, which is the heart and blood vessels, working along with the lymphatic system, which includes things like the lymph nodes. Now, the rest of the food that we can't use, that isn't necessary, needs to be removed. So this is called elimination, commonly called pooping, right? This is when we have undigested food components. They will move through a sphincter called the ileocecal valve to a large intestine. Now, the large intestine, there's very little digestion taking place here. The material would be stored and kind of packed in here. Water is going to be reabsorbed, so taken back in. Sometimes some additional nutrients may be resorbed. There's also some bacteria, healthy bacteria that are found within the large intestines that help to break down any of the toxins that might be remaining and produce some more nutrients. So as the food comes in, we have the different parts of what's called the colon. Right? The food kind of fills in here. Well, it's no longer food at this point. It's now waste. And this will stay in until there's a very large contraction or peristaltic contraction that will actually push the food out, or I keep saying food, but it's not food at this point, push the leftover product out through the anus. Okay, and so that is what's called elimination, and that occurs in the form of feces. So there are a lot of steps involved here. I do recommend that you go through and read the text and watch those videos for the overview. But because we have such a complex process here in terms of digestion, there are lots of places where things can go wrong. So let's just talk a little bit about some of the common disorders related to digestion. One of the big things has to do with how food gets from the esophagus into the stomach. We have a valve there, or sphincter there. Sometimes that fails slightly. And then the hydrochloric acid within the gastric juices of the stomach can actually get pushed up into the esophagus where it shouldn't be, because the esophagus doesn't have the proper mucosal lining to prevent against acid burns, basically. So what's called heartburn, if you've ever experienced heartburn, it's a feeling fairly high up on your chest, right about where the ribs meet, and it feels like a burning sensation. Now, people call it heartburn because it feels like it's your heart, but it's not, right? This is actually near the gastroesophageal sphincter. Now, there is something called GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease, which is a much more chronic illness. Some people may get heartburn occasionally if they overindulge in food or eat certain foods, whereas GERD is more regular, more chronic. There's also what are called ulcers. Okay? Now, the GI tract has, in some places, mucosal lining. If there are areas where the mucosal lining has been worn away, an ulceration can occur. So the hydrochloric acid can actually burn the tissue underneath it, and the pepsin can actually start to digest it. And that leads to what's called a peptic ulcer. And there are different kinds. There are stomach ulcers, which are called gastric ulcers. And then there's also what are called duodenal ulcers, and this would be in the duodenum, which is that first part of the small intestine. Now, there's been really great evidence that there are actually bacterial infections, something called Helicobacter pylori, and this contributes to both gastric and duodenal ulcers. Now, on the other side of things, there's also diarrhea. Now, I'm sure you've all know what diarrhea is, but really what's going on, diarrhea is when the undigestible food passes through the large intestine too quickly. So what's happening is water is not being reabsorbed. So the reason the feces at that point, the diarrhea, is so liquidy and mucousy is because the water is not being resorbed. So that can lead to some severe problems of dehydration. Now, an occasional bout of diarrhea is usually not problematic, but for small children, elderly people, people with other types of immune problems or health problems, diarrhea, especially frequent diarrhea, can become very problematic. Now, constipation, on the other hand, would be the opposite side of the spectrum, and this is when there's no stool. Stool is kind of the general term for feces, is passed. And what you can imagine is if food is being consumed but no waste is exiting, there starts to be a backup in the GI tract. So that's problematic as well. Now, there's another disorder that's called irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, and this is where you no longer have normal colon functioning, and there are some really severe problems or symptoms with this, including cramping and bloating, and it can lead to either diarrhea or constipation. And irritable bowel syndrome tends to be more common in women than in men, and there's really not a good marker or explanation for what causes irritable bowel syndrome. Now, this is just a few of some of the different disorders related to digestion. There are a slew of others out there. Now, the last part for this chapter is to read over the in-depth on food intolerances, food allergies, and then specifically celiac disease. And these are different things. And you will also then have a discussion board activity. So please read over the differences between food allergies and food intolerances and a celiac disease, and then do that associated discussion board.